Final stretch here. After today, we'll have finished the actual process of recovery, the first 7 steps. Okay. So anybody have a question on what we've gone over so far? We've got welcome.
I'm Kevin.
Hi, Kevin. Glad you're here, Kevin. If you want to, if you want to catch up for us, Kevin, if you want to catch up to us, you can go to YouTube, and that's the channel.
Okay.
You got 16 weeks to watch. That's they're an hour each. So, all right, all right. So last week we started talking about step 6, and we're doing 6 and 7, and the essence of that what we talked about was um, to slay the defect with non-action and to change the defect with action. All right, that's the idea of 6 and 7, and the catchphrase that I like to say with that is don't do what you want to do, make yourself do what you don't want to do. That produces change. Okay. And it's all about, we talked about the monkeys up in the tree, how they captured them, right? They letting go, they don't want to let go. But when we talk about this, there's so many people. I was just hit with this a couple hours ago. There's so many people with years of sobriety that just are don't ever want to look at themselves or think that they possibly could be wrong, you know. And they're good examples of what it is to be stark raving sober. And there's many people like that in the rooms. So, but they're all around us, so we have to deal with that.
A lot of that out there.
There's a lot of that out there. So what we want to do, step 6 is about becoming willing to let go. Because that's where where we left off last week. And so after all, for years we've worked uh, these, these defects in our life, and we've honed them in, and they've become part of our personalities, right? Uh, so in the fourth step, we looked at the character defects and how they cause pain and suffering in our life and other people's life. When we shared that with other people in step 5, we got some understanding on that. And now in 6 and 7, we got to start letting go of these things. And our literature says that some of them we don't want to let go of because we like them too much. And that's so true. You remember early on in one of the early weeks, we talked about I think it was 4 things that block us from God, and one of them was uh, uh, the dubious acts that we don't want to let go of, something like that. And that leads right into here in the defects. Okay, there's a great example. This is a true story. There's a golf course in South America that they spent, or maybe Central America. They spent millions of dollars building this golf course, and it's a beautiful golf course, beautiful part of the world. And when they opened, they didn't realize the problem that they had. The problem they had was that there's another monkey story. The problem that they had was the guys were hitting the golf, teeing off, and the monkeys were coming onto the greens and grabbing the golf ball, and and so they had a big meeting, right? Because everything was at stake here, and they had a big board meeting, and what can we do? Somebody said, well, we can shoot them. No, we can't do that. We can poison them. No, we can't do that. What if we just capture them and transport them somewhere else? No, you know, we can't do anything that's going to make the local people and the government, mad. So they just talked about it and talked about it, and they came out with a rule. This is the only golf course in the world that has this rule. And the rule is that you play the ball wherever the monkey drops it.
That's
Okay? And and so you know, when you listen to that, you wonder, are you able today to play the ball where the monkey drops it? Or you have to get in there and fix it and control it and make it the way you think you want it to be. In there lies all kinds of problems and untruths and stuff. So what we want to do here is we want to learn how to play the ball where the monkey drops it. So we want to let go of these defects that we have. And some of them we're not ready to let go of, but these steps cover that too. It says, because we pray for the willingness until it comes. So you don't have to be willing to let go of stuff, but we pray for the willingness till it comes. And so if you want to change, don't do what you want to do. If you don't do what you want to do, you can slay the old idea with inaction, the old thing, and then you can change it with action. But that's how this thing works. It's a slow process. As we stop doing the things that we want to do in step 6, we force ourselves to do the things that we don't want to do in step 7. As we practice this, we get benefits of this new thought pattern. It brings different returns, stuff that we're not used to having in our life. Over a period of time, we'll notice that these new ideas become a part of our personalities. That's just the way the defects became part of our personalities. We've practiced them and honed them in for years and years. And so now we have to deny that and start practicing something else. And that's how we change. And I think we talked about this last week, but one of the biggest mistakes people make in these steps, 6 and 7, is wondering what they're going to get if they do it. If I let go of this, what am I going to get? What's in it for me? That's our natural alcoholic and addict kind of mind frame and the greedy people, right? What's in it for me if I'm going to do this? And step 6 and 7 is not about what am I going to get? It's about what am I willing to let go of? And we have to look at it like that, okay? Because we want to hold on to shit. We just want to hold on to shit. There's the story about the 2 monks walking through the jungle to the monastery, and they're walking, they're silence, and they come to this path. There's a big giant puddle, and there's a lady standing there in a white gown, and her dilemma is obvious. There's a big muddy puddle in front of her. So one of the monks just went up to her. You need help? And he picked her up and he carried her across the puddle and he put her down, and she went her way. And the rest of the way, all the way to the monastery, the second monk was just shaking his head and steaming. Finally, before they got to the monastery, he's telling, I can't believe you talked to that lady. I can't believe you picked her up. I can't believe that. That's amazing that you did that. And, it was like an hour journey after the puddle to the monastery. And the first monk looked at the second one and said, I put her down an hour ago. But he's still carrying her. Right? So we got to learn how to let go of shit. There's in step 3, we learned that the good thing about step 3, the bonus in step 3 was learning how to get out of the result business. You remember that? We talked about that? All right. So if I'm learning how to get out of the result, if I'm getting out of the result business, then it's easier for me today, now in this part of the program, to let go of stuff. And if I can let go of all these defects and all these things that have ran me and ruined my life, I start finding out who I really am. There's another great story about Michelangelo, and somebody asked him once, how did he create that great sculpture of David? And Michelangelo's answer was amazing. He said it was easy. He just took a big block of marble and chipped away everything that wasn't David. And that is a lesson too, right? I come in here and you come in here and we got all this stuff on us that really isn't who we want to be. And so we're getting to this part of the program where now we start chipping this shit away and we become who we want to be. But that's the great thing about Alcoholics Anonymous or any of these programs, is that we get to be whoever we want to be. But we first have to understand and experience who we don't want to be. Once we experience who we don't want to be, we can be. When I came in here realizing one thing: I don't want to be a prisoner anymore in a cell. And then I realized I don't want to be a prisoner anymore over here. I need to be free of all you people and all that shit. And that is possible. That is possible. But first I have to experience who I don't want to be. So, all right. I'm going to read to you some stuff. This is, I don't know if a lot of you are familiar with Joe and Charlie. Joe, the old man Joe, wrote this little letter that I'm going to read to you. As they never did this in any of their studies or anything, but Joe wrote this, and it's really good. And it happened to him, and he just was kind of relaying what happened to him. He said, "I have a pretty rocking chair down in my office. When I first bought that building, someone had run off and left it behind. There wasn't anything there of any value, but there was this old rocking chair. It was a horrible looking mess, painted black with one of the rungs broken out of the back of it. I decided I'd keep it, thinking maybe one day I might put it together. Quite a few years went by, and it just sat up in the attic. Several times, some of the guys tempted me to throw it away. In fact, I'd find it around by the dumpster, and I'd bring it back in, saying I was going to look at it one of these days. So I finally got this old rocking chair out of the attic and into the light downstairs so I could really see it. As I began to look at it, I saw that it was really a fine chair. I got some paint stripper and began to strip it. I stripped all the paint away and found that it was solid oak. I took the old rag bottom that had been covered up many, many times with different cloths and tacks, and I tore it off and threw it all away. There was one broken rung, and I made an identical one by bending one and putting it in there. I sanded and refinished this chair. Finally, I took it to the upholstery shop. I asked the man there how much it would cost to put a nice white velvet bottom on it. He looked at me and he said, "I'll be glad to do that for you, but before I fix it, I'd like to offer you $350 for that chair." That beautiful, valuable chair was always there. It was there all the time. It was simply covered up. That chair had always been beautiful since the day the guy made it. And that's the way I am and you are, with God's life inside of us. God made us this way, beautiful and valuable. Like the rocking chair, over a period of years, I covered myself up with all sorts of things and made a big mess. The steps have enabled me to uncover, discover, and discard. It's a program of getting rid of the things to get down to what we want. So Joe wrote that. That's a pretty good little story there. So let's before we keep going on, is anybody got any questions on this? Because 6 and 7 is a lot of work, even though it's probably the least written about in our book. So who's got a question on this? Anybody need to ask about? Nobody?
We'll ask you when you're done.
Yes. The process of recovery. Yeah. 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 I think we talked about that in week 1 or week 2, that the process of recovery is the first 7 steps. Whatever you're working the steps on, you should have recovered from that at the end of step 7. You go through all of these steps, and by the end of step 7, the process of recovery is done. Now, I know somebody's sitting here thinking, well, we still got 5 more steps. Why is that? Well, because we have 8 and 9. That's to take care of stuff from the past. But now we're going after 7. Now we're going out, and we're not doing any more inward work on the steps. We're going out and we're fixing up our records of the past, 8 and 9. And then 10, we're doing 4 through 9 on a daily basis, right? And 11, we're improving our relationship with God. And 12, we're carrying this message and helping others. So all of that is it's all very pertinent to recovery and very important stuff, but it's not the process of recovery. The process of recovery you're going to find in these first 7 steps. that you will overcome or recover from whatever it is you're working the steps on by the end of step 7. Does that make sense to you guys? You'll find that, go ahead, Ken.
Can you explain again, just talk a little bit more on step where it says became entirely ready, entirely ready, exactly.
Well,
How do we know?
yeah,
we're
no, that's a
entirely
good question because the most people will think, and you'll hear it in the meetings all the time, AA bingo, AA bullshit stuff. Yeah. So step 6 says we're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. And most people, a lot of people in the rooms will say that, it's God's job to remove the defects. And that's correct, but that's not correct by itself, because they're missing the first part of that sentence. We're entirely ready to have God remove the defects. Okay. So what does that mean? I have found for me that the God in my life is such a gentleman. He's never going to interfere in my life where I don't want him to. What do I mean by that? It's my actions. It's not my prayers and my thoughts. It's my actions that tell God, do I want him to interfere in my life or not? And so if I'm praying for God to do this or that and getting off of my knees and doing quite the opposite, my God's not going to interfere. He's just going to say, okay, go ahead. So when I change, it's because God thinks or God realizes that I have become entirely ready. And so there's a lot of work in step 6 to be done. People think there's nothing to be done. It's God's job to no. All the work is in the entirely ready part. Entirely ready to have God remove these defects of character. And then in the next step says, humbly asked him to remove our shortcomings. Well, what does humbly mean? That's not like begging. Humbly doesn't mean I'm begging, or humbly doesn't mean that I'm in some type of yoga or meditation form, and I'm humbly means that I'm right sizing myself. And how do I right size myself? I try to do the next right thing. I try to do what's right. There's no bullshitting us anymore. Ourselves anymore. We know what's right and what's wrong. In fact, I've always known what's right and what's wrong. Even when I was out there all those years, I just didn't give a shit. I was just too selfish and self-centered to not do what I wanted to. So my humbly is right sizing myself and doing what I'm supposed to do. So stop practicing wrong as you understand it, and practice right as you understand it. Stop practicing what you know is wrong and start practicing right as you understand it. That's a good thing to look at. So when we say entirely ready, if I get to the step 6 and I pray, God, take away this anger or this, whatever the defect may be, my greed or whatever it is, right? God, take away this greed from me. Well, the chances of that happening are slim to none. It's kind of like when you got sober, right? If God, if you just was able to pray to God and have your alcoholism or your drug addiction taken from you, then there wouldn't be enough room in these rooms for people, because we'd all have seats in here, right? But the fact is, that's only part of it, praying to God. The other part is that I have to participate in my recovery. And why do you think that I have to participate in my recovery, but when it comes to step 6, I don't? That's silly, right? And in fact, we're ignoring the step. But it says we're entirely ready. What do you mean by entirely ready? Well, just showing up is not entirely. Just asking for something is not entirely. Just praying for something is not entirely. Entirely is when I do everything that I could be doing to not practice this defect, and everything I could be doing to practice the opposite of this defect. Now I'm entirely ready. Now God will remove, yes, it is God's job to remove the defect.
Totally acts against my will. It is.
Absolutely. It's an absolute act against my will. But I think because it is an act against my will, I think that for some reason, I don't think God removes any of this stuff. I think he lets it rest. And I think he just lets it subside. But it's still there. It's still there. You can pick it up anytime you want, you know.
So coming at it from the opposite side, if you're working with somebody who struggled with the idea of God and all along, everything from faith background, but was able to do a thorough third step and make a decision, come to believe in some higher power. And he gets to step 6. He says, well, I can do this. Like I'm entirely ready. And I'm just gonna keep working the steps and not, why do I need God to remove these footprints? I can do it. How do you deal with that?
Go back to 2 and 3. Because that's where your problem is. In step 2, we come to the search for, when we went over it here, the search for God begins in step 2. The spiritual growth begins in step 2. The connection that you make with God begins in step 2. And in step 3, we're not so much looking at God as we are about looking at self-will in step 3. So when somebody goes a thorough second step, a thorough third step, and they get to step 6, that the last thing in their mind is, I could do this, I don't need God. Because if you've done those steps properly, when you get to 6, you go, especially with these things that we don't want to let go of, right? That we love too much. Oh boy, do I need you, God. That's the attitude that you have to have. When you have the attitude, then you go back to step 3, because it's important to go back to step 3 on that situation, not because of God, but because of self-will. That's where we address self-will, right? What does it say in on page 60, right? The ABCs of how it works, step 1 and step 2 and step 2. Being convinced, we're at step 3, which is that we decide to turn our will and our life over to God as we understood him. Just what do we mean by that? And just what do we have to do? The first requirement is that we be convinced that any life run on self-will could hardly be a success. Now, if you remember when we went over that, I said to you guys, nobody at this point is convinced that any life run on self-will could hardly be a success. Though we say we are, but we're really not. It takes some time and some work to get to the point that you really are convinced that any life run on self-will could hardly be a success. So when you go back to step 3, you're not going back to step 3 for God. You're going back to step 3 for the self-will part. Because the next 2 pages following this is all about self-will, right? Everybody wants to be the actor and the director and the charge of the lights and all of that stuff. And if everybody did what I wanted them to do, the world would be much better, right? That's what it all talks about in there. So, and all of that is bullshit, of course. So yeah, when you get to step 6, if you are even thinking about you don't need God for this step, then you're missing something back on 2 and 3. That's a good question, though.
I have a prayer sheet that has like each of the prayers and then like guidance, and it also has a piece that just is like, for me, someone who's worked the steps on my alcoholism, now it's like all those other pieces of my life. It has a piece that's just when I am aware of my own defects and seeking God's help to change. And then it like gives you guidance on.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, that's good stuff. And that's the thing, right? How many people really in the rooms actually work all 12 steps on their alcoholism, right? And then turn around and take it easy for the next 15 years. There's so many people in the rooms that 15 years sober or 20 years sober, they worked the steps 15 years ago, 20 years ago. It's a daily program. It's a 12-step program. It's not a one-step program. You don't take a step and put it on a problem, and you don't take a break. You continuously work steps. So if you follow this course like we do, I'm sure everybody in this room has worked the steps already, or most of the steps, right? So why are you here? Because we're learning how to work the steps on things other than alcohol and drugs. That's what this is about. Yeah,
Spiritual weight,
yeah.
spiritual experience has to be a continuous thing. Like it's-
Not just that, Levi. What does the 12 step say? What does the 12 step say? Having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, right? What am I looking at?
That's it. Number 20.
See, I put my glasses on, right? We tried to carry this message that alcoholics should practice these principles in all our affairs. I can't see shit without my glasses. I'm standing there with, looking at it. Right? That's some stupid shit, don't we? I was in my meeting a couple of weeks ago, my Sunday morning meeting, and somebody across the room was. I sit on one side, somebody on the other side was sharing. And I couldn't hear them, and so I was squinting my eye to hear them better. Where did that come from? Now, not only couldn't I hear them, I couldn't even see them anymore.
How do you have the closed captioning?
I'm sitting there like this. I'm like, what the hell am I doing? Acting like a Chinese guy or something? No, like this is stupid shit. I'm standing here trying to read it with the glasses in my hands.
Follow the numbers.
Yeah. But you're absolutely right. You know, and the steps. Our literature tells us to. This is something. That's why I put this up here today. The willingness to look at the truth is not optional. Your life depends on it. Your life depends on looking at the truth and what is the truth. Yeah. So the other thing that's a little confusing is all the different words you hear, like in step 4, it's flaws, and step 5 is wrongs, and step 6 is defects, and step 7 is shortcomings. Right? We've talked about this numerous times, and you know, I just AA bingo bullshit is when I sit in a room and somebody's taking 10 minutes sharing about the difference between defects and shortcomings. You know, it's part of our history, and all you have to do is look it up. Because Bill Wilson was asked, "What is the difference?" and he said nothing. Just don't want to keep using the same word. You know, that was his answer to that question. So there may be in the dictionary, there may be more than one definition of each of those things, and they may not be. But for us, what we're using it here is it's the same thing. You know, a shortcoming, a defect. I had a guy tell a story about golfing. One shortcoming, I can't remember how it went. One shortcoming, one was defects. And after the meeting, I went up to him. I said, "That was really good." He said, "Oh, thanks, Dan." I said, "It's not true, but it was really good."
Really sold it.
Yeah. No, I said that was really interesting. Yeah, thanks, Dan. It wasn't true. It was certainly interesting. So, thank you. All right. So we're going over a lot of stuff, but the bottom line with this is I'm going to read some more things to you. These are just little interesting things I took off of the internet over the years.
Have they been fact checked?
No. No. Okay. Have you ever heard the carrot, the egg, or the coffee bean? Have you heard that one? A young woman went to her grandmother and told her about her life and how things were so hard for her. Thank you. She did not know how she was going to make it and wanted to give up. She was tired of fighting and struggling. It seemed that as one problem was solved, a new one arose. Her grandmother took her to the kitchen. She filled 3 pots with water and placed each on high fire. Soon the pot came to a boil. In the first, she placed carrots. In the second pot, she placed eggs. In the last, she placed ground coffee beans. She let them sit and boil without saying a word. In about 20 minutes, she turned off all the burners. She fished the carrots out and placed them in a bowl. Then she pulled the eggs out and placed them in another bowl. And then she ladled the coffee and placed it in another bowl. Turning to her granddaughter, she asked, "Tell me, what do you see?" "Carrots, eggs, and coffee," she replied. uh, no, no, I just got a kick that. She brought her closer and asked her to feel the carrots. She did and noted that they were soft. Then she asked her to take an egg and break it. After pulling off the shell, she observed a hard-boiled egg. Finally, she asked her to sip the coffee. The daughter smiled as she tasted its rich aroma. The grandmother then asked, "What does it mean?" The granddaughter asked, "What does it mean, Grandma?" And the grandmother explained that each of these objects had faced the same adversity, boiling water, but each reacted differently. The carrot went in strong, hard, and unrelenting. However, after being subjected to the boiling water, it softened and became weak. The egg had been fragile. Its thin outer shell had protected its liquid interior, but after sitting through the boiling water, its inside became hardened. The ground coffee beans were unique, however. They were in the boiling water. They changed the water. "Which are you?" asked her grandmother. When adversity knocks on the door, how do you respond? Are you a carrot, an egg, or a coffee bean? Think of this. Which am I? Am I the carrot that seems strong, but with pain and adversity do I wilt and become soft and lose my strength? Am I the egg that starts with a malleable heart, but changes with the heat? That I have fluid spirit, but after a death or a breakup or some other trial, I become hardened and stiff? Does my shell look the same, but on the inside am I bitter and tough with the stiff spirit and hardened heart? Or am I the coffee bean? The bean actually changes the water, the very circumstances that brings the pain. When the water gets hot, it releases the fragrance and flavor of your life. If you are like the bean, when things are at its worst, you get better and change the situation around you. When the hours are the darkest and the trials are their greatest, do you elevate to another level? How do you handle adversity? Are you changed by your surroundings, or do you bring life flavor to them? Are you a carrot, an egg, or a coffee bean? Now it's over. So I always read these things. There's another one here. This one I've seen on the internet a lot, but when I first got this years and years ago, it wasn't on the internet. It wasn't, well, there was no internet. The mayonnaise jar. Have you heard the mayonnaise jar? When things in your life seem almost too much to handle, when 24 hours in a day is not enough, remember the mayonnaise jar and 2 cups of coffee. A professor stood before his philosophy class and had some items in front of him. When the class began, wordlessly he picked up a very large and empty mayonnaise jar and fills it with golf balls. Then he asked the students if the jar was full. They agreed that it was. The professor then picked up a box of pebbles and poured it into the jar. He shook the jar lightly. The pebbles rolled into the open areas between the golf balls. He then asked the students again if the jar was full. They agreed it was. The professor next picked up a box of sand and poured it into the jar. Of course, the sand filled up everything else. He asked once more if the jar was full. The students responded with a unanimous yes. The professor then produced 2 cups of coffee from under the table and poured the entire contents into the jar, effectively filling the empty space between the sand. The students laughed. "Now," said the professor, as the laughter subsided, I want you to recognize that this jar represents your life. The golf balls are the important things. God, family, children, health, friends, and favorite passions. Things that if everything else was lost and only they remained, your life would still be full. The pebbles are the things that matter, like your job, your house, your car. The sand is everything else, the small stuff. If you put the sand into the jar first, there's no room for the pebbles or the golf balls. The same goes for life. If you spend all your time and energy on the small stuff, you'll never have room for the things that are important to you. So pay attention to the things that are critical to your happiness. Worship your family, play with your children, take your partner out to dinner, spend time with good friends. There will always be time to clean the house and fix the dripping tap. Take care of the golf balls first, the things that really matter. Set your priorities. The rest is just sand. One of the students raised his hand and inquired what the coffee represented. The professor smiled and said, I'm glad you asked. It goes to show that no matter how full your life may seem, there's always room for a couple cups of coffee with a friend.
Good. That's good.
All right. Now, here's a good one. I'll tell you this, after this, years ago, my daughter she's, oh shit, what's today?
Today's the
Next
17th.
week. My daughter's going to be 49 next week. Wow. She was like 25 or something. I asked her this question and she scared the shit out of me with her answer. I thought she was doomed, but she turned her life around. So here's the thing. You're driving down the road in your car on a wild, stormy night when you pass by a bus stop and you see three people waiting for the bus. An old lady who looks like she's about to die, an old friend who once saved your life, the perfect partner you've been dreaming about. Which one would you choose to offer a ride to? Knowing that only one passenger could get in your car. I'm sorry, it's the other thing I was going to say with my daughter, not this one, but this is a good one too. So, think about that. Which one would you pick up? Right? You only got one room for one person in your car. It turns out that this was a question on a job interview for a big corporation, for an executive thing. And so I answered that myself. I pick up the perfect partner, right? The person that got the job though said, I would give the car keys to my old friend and let him take the lady to the hospital, and I would stay behind and wait for the bus with the partner of my dreams. I never thought of that shit, man. That didn't even cross my mind. So here's the one with my daughter that she scared me. There was I don't have it written down. I just have a note on it. So there was a wake going on, and a guy met this woman at the wake, and he was really enchanted by her, and she was enchanted with him. And at the end of the night, he had left, and she didn't get his number. He didn't get her number, and so the next day, she killed her mother. And the question is, why'd she kill her mother?
Oh.
That's what my daughter said. And if you are a psychopath if you answered that correctly. The thing is, if you answer that, because my daughter said, without missing a beat, she said, so he would come to the, and, oh man, she's in trouble. Because the answer to that is, if you answer it correctly, you're a psychopath. No wonder why Joe sleeps with one eye open. Okay. All right. So anyway, I thought you'd enjoy those little things. Even I didn't think of that answer. Yeah. Yeah. And it was very natural, as she said.
Yeah.
Like that. Okay. All right. So let's look at now, if there's nothing else to talk about 6 and 7, we have completed the process of recovery. Has anybody got any questions, want to go over anything from step 1 to step 7? We've got plenty of time left.
Seeking things 4 times, even seven, I think you see it. What you were saying, this has nothing to do, I got, I don't know, I might have heard you. Nothing to do with recovery. Of being convinced that I'm always over alcohol my life. And being convinced, even in the third step. It's like now, being convinced, but now it's step 3.
Yes. Yeah, but we have to be we have to be convinced that any life run on self-will could hardly be a success. And what it says is, yeah, it says being convinced. It says it twice. Being convinced after the A, B, and C. We were now at step 3. And then the next paragraph says the first requirement is that we be convinced that any life run on self-will could hardly be a success. And it's a kind of a strong word, convinced.
Yeah.
Because we may think we're convinced, we may say we're convinced, but we don't act that way. You know, many people, if you ask everybody, you go to any meeting you want, ask everybody in that room individually, not in front of everybody, but individually ask them, is God everything or is God nothing? Probably everybody's going to say God is everything. But half of the people in the room, their life is shambles. Their life is shit. They got all kinds of things going on in their life. If they really think that God is everything, why are you living that way? Why do you have those issues going on in your life? What's going on with you? Right? So we say these things. We say we're convinced. We say that God is everything, but we don't act that way. And that's what we're trying to do here when we're working on emotional sobriety. Is we're trying to. This is a different level of sobriety. When you're doing emotional sobriety now, is actually doing the little things that you're supposed to do. When we talk about, so when we say God is everything, we act like God is everything. When we say we're convinced, we act like we're convinced.
So if someone goes on the 4th step, you were saying it has to be 2 or 3.
No, one. It's one.
So convinced is part of the process.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. But whoever goes out on step 4, it's never about step 4. It's just an excuse. You know, it's been an excuse for years and years and years. Because what is step 4? It's shit you already done, right? Now you're just putting it down so you can look at it. What it is somebody goes out, anybody that goes out, according to our literature, we talked about this way back in step 1. There's 2 reasons for that. One, they never took 100% first step. All right. Our literature says the first step has to be done 100%. The only step that has to be done 100%. Or 2, they failed to enlarge their spiritual life. Those are the 2 reasons why somebody go back out. No matter where they're at and what's going on in their life, it's one of those 2 reasons.
It doesn't matter what step it is.
Doesn't matter what step they
Yeah.
got to.
Like you said, 1 to 7, that's part.
But 1 to 7 is the process of recovery, but it's not the process of surrendering. The process of surrendering comes back in. Well, all of them is a little surrendering, but the first step is about the first step is the only step about the problem, right? Alcohol or whatever you're working the steps on. So the rest of the steps don't mention the problem. They're about the solution and the program of action. So step 1 is about the problem. So if you find yourself drinking booze, which was the problem before, and now it's the problem again, you're back at step 1. And so many people, they go back out, they come back in, and their sponsor, they were on the 4th step, and their sponsor, now, come over to my house, we're going to finish that 4th step. No. Take their ass back to step 1. because that's where they need to be. You know, they don't need to be writing no inventory, and they just got drunk yesterday.
I did talk to the staff, and the thinking was following awakening. But it wasn't the spiritual awakening, but the awakening was after 13 years, is how changing the outcome of everything. Harm, God, patience. Did not give me the recovery. It's the recovery. And that's the new.
Yeah.
Confidence.
Yeah, we're good at that. People like us are good at that. You know, we try to find something outside of ourselves to make us feel whole. You know, the hole is here. Yeah, the hole is here. I can't take a car and plug the hole up, or a house. I can't, I can't do that. So I have to. Nothing outside of me is going to fill the hole. You know, that's between me and God. That problem, and that's what these steps put us back together. Hopefully.
Ask if it doesn't fit, question maybe somebody ask you after the meeting.
It's okay.
I did step 4, 5, and 6 months month. Left something out at 5. I couldn't sleep that night, so I called the next day and I told him. 2 days later, I call him, he left the state. And he was and, oh,
Well, don't say that shit with us now. Yeah. Let me ask you a question. Did you do 1, 2, and 3 with your sponsor? Okay. But you said you did 4, 5, and 6. Yeah.
called every day, called me, well, I knew house, North Carolina. And
Well, what you don't necessarily have to start all over again with a new sponsor. If I was your new sponsor, you'd start all over again, but you wouldn't start all over again on alcohol and drugs if you didn't go back out. But we'd start working the steps on some. I've got guys with 30, 40 years of sobriety that I sponsor that I put them right on step 1, but not necessarily on alcohol or drugs. But and that's the whole idea, is to work these steps on what the thing says here, on whatever we got. You know, you do the 12 steps on alcohol and drugs, and then you do them on whatever. You know, we're not talking cured here. So, but I heard a guy share years and years ago. He said that his sponsor died, and he had to get a new sponsor right away because he had to have one person on earth knowing just how sick he really was, and he had to share his 5th step with that person. And it was kind of funny, but it made a lot of sense. I get that, But if you got something that's not, good, you can always go to a priest. You don't have to be a Catholic, but you can always go to a priest and share. Yeah.
5,
Do what they say.
Yeah, you could. Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah. How long ago did this happen? Okay. Yeah. Well, sure. It's like if you represent yourself in court, right? You have the stupidest attorney in the world, and if right now you have the worst sponsor in the world, yourself. So, yeah. So,
Talking about step 1. You know, many times we in step 1. Inevitably, everybody should.
yes.
And
I ain't been wrong.
Just like to share.
There was a guy last year in the Western Club that was the speaker, and the step was step one. And he shared for 15, 20 minutes. And afterwards, after the meet was over, I thanked him for sharing. I do that every week. I thank whoever shared and thank whoever chaired. And he said, Danny, what'd you think of step one? I said, you didn't say anything about the solution. All you talked about was getting drunk. He said, yeah, I didn't talk about it. You didn't say nothing about the step, nothing about anything positive. You just talked about, and everybody in the room shared about, like you just said. 2 months later, he killed himself. Now I'm not saying that because of he shared, but obviously he was not in a good spiritual place. Because if I talk about step one, I don't need to talk about my drunkalog. I need to talk about the solution. I talk about any step. I need to talk about the solution. I need to talk about what the book says. I need to talk about my experience from working that step. You know, everybody here got a story. I know. Who gives a shit? Did you have something to say?
I'm just, I just loved that. Sometimes my face just talks. I haven't mastered that part.
Yes.
That's what you share. You don't share about your experience. Good drinking.
Well, you qualify. It depends where you're sharing at. Okay, if you're sharing from the podium on a thing, then it was in a general way what it was like, what happened, and what it's like today. A general way, not spend 25 minutes of a speaker meeting talking about getting loaded. That's not a general way. That's 45, 50%. Okay, now if you share 25 minutes about getting loaded, that's not a general way. So in a general way, I want to qualify. But I could qualify without talking about drunkalouds. I could just qualify. You know how I qualify? Tell you how I feel. Tell you how I felt when I got here. Tell you what I was going through and what I was feeling. Many of you heard my story. I don't, I tell some jokes about that, but I don't spend time about drunkalouds. There's no need for that. I mean, I didn't wake up one morning and say my life was great. I think I'll join AA. You know, for me, like many of you, this was the last house on the block for me. I was lucky that I made it here. And, and we all have that similarity. We all have that same story. So why do I need to tell you about how I drank or how much dope I did? It's irrelevant. What the end of your drinking and using career, we all wind up in the same place, alone, hurting, and desperate. That's where this stuff takes us. So if you come here and you're not, you're not alone, hurting, and desperate, maybe you're not in the right place. I don't know, because that's where it takes a real alcoholic, a real drug addict. You know,
Yeah, what it was like. What you got? Doc's opinion, Bill's story, Doc's solution, my brother alcohol. The sheriff. And that's what step one is about. The drunk along.
no, you're right. So on page 30, I'll get you in a second. Page 30. This is what it says. Third paragraph down. We alcoholics are men and women who have lost the ability to control our drink, and we know that no real alcohol ever recovers control. All of us have felt at times we regaining control, but such intervals usually brief or neverly followed by still less control, which led in time to pitiful and incomprehensible demoralization. We are convinced to a man that alcoholics in our type are in a grip of a progressive illness. Over any considerable period, we get worse, never better. If you don't relate to that, then you might not be in the right place when you get here.
The system responsive is not explicitly explained in the. There are moments where you're supposed to meet with someone, this stuff, for example, it talks about meeting with a trusted religious figure, talk about maybe doing morning devotions with your spouse, things like that, but there's none of the system that we know today. And I know it's there in the 12 stuff, but it obviously developed in that time. How, from your perspective, how did that system come to be from the 12 steps in the first round?
Good question. It is in the book. It's just not in the word sponsor. But you have many examples in the book where they went to the hospital to visit Bill Dobson, Bill D, AA number 3. He's the guy on the bed. There's probably a picture somewhere around, but the guy on the bed, right? That's Bill Dobson. He's AA number 3. They went there and they spoke, and they went, and then there's Jim, and there's all the stories about Fred, and all the stories about, and then Ebby coming to, Ebby was Bill's sponsor. And Ebby came to his house, and he was bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, right? He wasn't drunk like he had always been. So there's many, and in the back of the book, in the stories, they talk about that. They just don't use the word sponsor, but in those days, if you were, they would go out and get you, and you would have a sponsor, and I've been to many strong home groups where if you walk in there and you come back to that group, you ain't coming back, and you're not sitting by yourself and being lost in the crowd. You're going to be grabbed, and you're going to be all over you, and that's the sponsorship that I come from, that kind of stuff.
So the paragraph you just read, and you're talking about the decomprehensible demoralization. Joe Blow off the street. Well, me personally, I don't know what that means. I walk into a speaker meeting. I need you to break that down for me. I need you to relate. I need you to qualify so that I give me that experience so I can say, oh, that was me. Oh, that was me.
Yeah.
I need that.
Yeah.
So I understand not being stuck on it for 30 minutes. But I think that's also part of your growth in AA. A lot of people, when they get here and they speak, they do talk about that, right? That is their story. They don't have a lot of the experience of learning to share on the solution, the whole solution, or breaking that down. And I think that's part of your time here and your growth.
Well, you're absolutely right. And that's what we do here in this study.
Yeah.
We break it down. And I got a good lesson of that years and years ago. I was sponsoring this guy. He was just in his first month of sobriety, and there was a speaker meeting, and I knew the speaker was coming from out of town, and he was an excellent speaker. And so I took him with me, and we're sitting right up front, and the guy was just dropping all kinds of pearls of wisdom and all this great shit, and I was eating it up. And after the meeting, I says to my sponsor, wasn't that great? He said, yeah. And I realized, hey, you don't understand the message yet. Yeah, you don't understand all the wisdom this guy was dropping was going right over his head. He didn't get it, but that's where he was. So anyway, I kind of stretched out this week so we can finish the first 7 steps. Next week we're gonna do 8, 9, and we probably got about 6 or 7 weeks left. So thank you guys, I appreciate it.